Welcome, everybody, to another insightful episode of The Empowered Defender. It's our third episode of the series, and today I'm thrilled to invite our CEO here at Darklight to talk about prioritization. Dan, thanks for joining us.
As always, Thomas, great to be here. Thanks for organizing this, and certainly to our marketing team as well. Appreciate the effort.
Absolutely. Thanks again. And before we delve into our discussion, let's explore some key insights. Did you know that on average, it takes a staggering 271 days to address a vulnerability? And even more, considering nearly 1/3 of detected vulnerabilities remain open after a year. It's clear that prioritization is key to staying ahead of the curve and ensuring robust cyber defenses. Now let's explore some common pitfalls that organizations encounter. Scanning without administrative credentials, overlooking security devices like firewalls, or over-customizing scan templates can impede the prioritization process. These pitfalls highlight the importance of adopting a strategic approach to prioritization. And who better is to shed light on this than Dan? Again, Dan, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us today to discuss the critical role of prioritization in cybersecurity.
Thanks, Thomas. And obviously a quick shout out to our partner at Tenable. I know that we stole that stat of the 271 days from a recent event they hosted. So that's very good data and kind of shows what a challenge this issue is. So I'm excited to talk about this today and looking forward to have some interaction from our audience as we get going related to what questions you might have on how to do prioritization. And Thomas, I know we have a fairly structured event here, but certainly we like the back and forth. When we think about prioritization, is there a certain area you'd like me to start or just pontificate based on experience?
Let's go with the second, right? Pontificate on experience, if you will.
So one of the things that's actually a newer piece of information I just got in my very recent readings is when you think about a vulnerability, and one of the ways that we currently, I say we, and this is generalization, not everyone does it this way, is we do a scan of, hopefully with credentials, an internal environment. This is something we are finding with some of our prospects and clients, is that even the term a vulnerability scan doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. So some may do a scan, but they're only looking at that they're publicly facing infrastructure. And we call that really an attack surface scan. So what's facing the public, so you can try to make sure those are locked down. But what we're going to spend a lot of time on here is truly an internal scan. So with the machines, the devices, the printers, et cetera, the routers that you have within your organization, they're being scanned with credentialed access. And credentialed access just means that the scanner can really get into that device and understand what exists, what software there, what version of that software exists, and then compare those to a list of known vulnerabilities. And so that's just from a background. That's kind of where we're starting from, is understanding what a vulnerability scan is. Sure. One of the big issues is, okay, now we have a list of vulnerabilities, which generally, if people aren't keeping up on this, a small company can have literally thousands of vulnerabilities. So where do you start? And one of the key phrases in our mission here is to take overwhelmed victims in cybersecurity and turn them into empowered defenders, hence the name of this webinar series. So when you think of, go ahead, Thomas.
I'm sorry, I said nice plug, Dan. Thank you.
Oh, of course. It's you make me do those things, Thomas. When you think of thousands of vulnerabilities, even if you're a large company, how do you really attack those? And so prioritization is how you attack those. And what does prioritization mean? Well, first, as we talked about in a previous webinar series, is making sure we understand what risk is. And so risk is likelihood times impact equals risk. And so most scanners that are developing or that are running a scan and giving you a prioritization of which vulnerabilities to fix first are very focused on what's called the CVSS scoring system, which is an extremely important piece of understanding how aggressive or how critical an individual vulnerability is, but that's a very myopic look. It's one piece of the pie. And without understanding other additional informations about that exploit, so a vulnerability is either being actively exploited, known to be actively exploited, or not known to be actively exploited, even though it is a known vulnerability in said software, hardware, firmware, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So what begins to happen is we need to prioritize this thousands of vulnerabilities by comparing those vulnerabilities to other sources of data that are freely available to the public, but very hard to operationalize without tools like what we provide or what others certainly provide as well. And let's just take a few examples of this. I know we want to talk about KEV. If you can pull up what KEV, this is something that comes out from CISA. And so what this takes, if you just had this one enrichment source,
Mm-hmm.
and you say, okay, we've got a known vulnerability, CVE 1999-whatever, that's a known vulnerability. And now CISA sees that that vulnerability is being actively exploited by X nation state or Y organized crime syndicate, what have you. So now with that information and the KEV information added to the CVE information, we may increase the prioritization of that particular vulnerability to be fixed or decrease, depending on the circumstances in the environment. And that's what we mean by enrichment sources, of adding more and more data and information sources about two things. Really, when you think about it fundamentally, likelihood and impact. So when we think of likelihood, if you have a CVE that now has a is noticed by CISA in the KEV system, that's suggesting that the likelihood has gone up because there are known active exploits going on today. So that increases the likelihood piece. So in theory, that increases your risk. So this is really the framework we're talking about on prioritization.
Dan,
Thomas, are you tracking so far? I don't want to keep going on here without.
I am, and that actually brings up a really good talking point. So when our different customers, clients across the world, just people in general, if you will, they're getting this scanner data back from whatever scanner they're using, and they're getting a ranking, if you will, critical to low as far as these vulnerabilities go. What's the difference between that data set, right, and when you start implying this threat intelligence to it? How does that enrichment differentiate, if you will?
Well, it's really just adding more pieces to the puzzle. So
Sure.
if we think in terms of a puzzle, 100, let's just make it a 100-piece puzzle. When you get your CVSS score, let's just say you get your list of vulnerabilities. That is your puzzle pieces. So they're upside down, they're mixed up, you have really no idea, but you've got to find a place for them or do something with it. And maybe this analogy won't work, but I'll keep going with it. And then you look at the box, the picture box, and it's very clear that there's somebody face right in the dead center of the puzzle. And when you flip all the puzzle pieces over, you can see that there's the nose of the face. So that might be your KEV. So this is something we want to start with, deal with this first, put this dead center, and then start filling around it. And so what enrichment sources do is they fill in the puzzle pieces for you to better identify the highest risk issues. So again, likelihood plus impact equals risk. And there's just no way to deal with every vulnerability. And I feel bad, especially for the small and medium businesses where they get this list from a scanner and like, what do I do? And if they just start doing with what the base scanner informations are telling you, which is only generally, again, this is general, only a CVSS score,
right?
That's not telling you the whole story. It's very hard to deal with that. And what we call that is vulnerability whack-a-mole. You're just hoping to fix the right vulnerability at the right time.
And that makes a lot of sense.
So the enrichment sources create a better, makes it easier for you to understand risk and fill in the puzzle.
Right. No, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So if you were to think about it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the most critical vulnerability on your scan report is traditionally going to be that, right? It could actually be that since the last time that scan was done, something that was marked as the most critical with things that are happening in the real world and, threat feed intelligence being applied to that same scan, that might drop to a low, and something that's low could potentially jump to a high or even critical.
Absolutely right, Thomas. And this is really, again, another challenge our industry faces.
Mhm.
When you do a scan, that's a point in time. So you're doing a scan, that's a point in time. The data you're getting back from the scanner, including our partner Tenable, is fantastic data. Generally speaking, if you're using a good tested brand like Tenable, but that's a snapshot in time. And that snapshot in time is giving you a scoring and a prioritization based on that exact moment. Well, the National Vulnerability Database, just one of them that's providing lists of CVEs and CVSS scoring, that changes and is updated every 4 hours.
Yeah.
And so every 4 hours, there could be, doesn't always happen, but so I don't want to create too much fear out there where it doesn't exist, but it is a very actively managed source of enrichment. And
Sure.
so when those things change, or Kev, so let's say that a new breach was found wherever, going back in time to Home Depot or Target,
Mhm.
as people do the forensics on that very large breach, they discover, when I say people, FBI, that gets up to CISA, how that breach occurred. They realize or find that particular vulnerability was exploited by this bad guy. And so that creates, a posting, and there all of a sudden we know that we have a Kev issue that is increasing the likelihood of that vulnerability being used. And if you want to take it one step further, once we understand what adversary is using or known to be using that exploit, that's where you also get into the likelihood equation. And this gets into something that's also very important, is business context. So that gets into the impact side of the
Great.
likelihood versus impact. How does this impact my business?
Mhm.
If I'm a bricks and mortar cafe versus an e-commerce, in the ether business, my impact could be very different based on what type of adversary or vulnerability exists. And so once we understand who the bad guy is using that exploit, you can then start to even apply threat intelligence on the adversary to further prioritize your thousands of lists. And I realize this sounds complicated. That's why, firms, hire experts, and those experts use tools, again, for the plug, like SIO and others. But
Yep.
the prioritization is just so important, because otherwise you're chasing shadows, and you're really not necessarily improving your security posture despite a huge amount of effort.
Dan, that makes a lot of sense, right? You really have to be able to take a puzzle and start to build a clearer picture. And the way that you're able to do that is by enriching the data. And you have to continuously be doing that because it's a real world situation. It's not something that's stagnant, it's continuously evolving. So that pattern of prioritization, it does make sense. And I appreciate you walking me through that. One of the other things that we really want to talk about, right, and it's part of the prioritization process, if you really will, is time being of the essence for small companies, big companies. In that moment, if something happens with one of those vulnerabilities where it is exploited, all of a sudden the whole situation changes, right? So it really is having that time of the essence from discovery to remediation. One of the things that we really talked about earlier that I found really interesting is that on average, it takes 271 days to address a vulnerability. What are your thought process about that timeline? And how is that weighing on just commercial America or, MSSPs, businesses in general?
Well, I'm going to try to get the source right, because I just read something this morning about this. So let's talk first in terms of the 271 days. Now, that's a scary thought, and from my money and running a business like this and others in the past, that's an average. And
Right.
what we're hoping for is that average includes solving those lower risk vulnerabilities. So obviously, if it takes me 250 days or 300 days to fix something that's extremely low priority, meaning low impact, low likelihood, so very low risk, fine. I don't care.
Yep.
But if my critical and high risk issues aren't being fixed in like less than 10 days, then I have a problem. And again, I'll come back to the source. I think it's Patrick Garrity, but again, I don't want to miss it. But I just read it this morning.
Sure.
Um, he reposted something that came out of the UK on reminding everybody the reality that exists. So when a vulnerability is put out, so when a new vulnerability is found, whether it's acknowledged in the National Vulnerability Database, or Metasploit is another great source of vulnerabilities that may not have made it to the NVD yet, and there's other sources like Metasploit, and we can talk about what that is in a little bit. But when a vulnerability is put out into the open, and we call that the wild, so that people can go have a chance to fix them, the bad guys know those vulnerabilities now exist, and the bad guys may not have known those vulnerabilities existed in the past. So it's even more critical if you think through the logic there is if National Vulnerability Database, just take that one, is updating every 4 hours with new vulnerabilities, and the bad guys can see what new vulnerabilities are out. They now know, if I've got this group of targets that I want to penetrate and hack, now I know that there's a new vulnerability in this Adobe or whatever software, and now I can use. I may have known that vulnerability existed. Now I can use it to exploit the system I've been surveilling. And so it's another reason to have a well-built system to prioritize, because every day that a vulnerability is known to the public is a day that the bad guys can take advantage of it until you fix it. So we cannot stress enough on how important it is not to chase the thousands list of vulnerabilities, because you'll never win that battle.
That's right.
It's just so important to try to enrich that, including business context, to just focus on the ones that matter to you. You'll never be 100%, but let's get to that 90 to 95%, area on the stuff that matters the most, and just attack it one step at a time.
And Dan, that really painted the perfect picture there for myself and I believe the audience. And audience, thank you again for joining. And if you have questions as Dan and I are going through and having this discussion, please feel free and add them in so that way we can address them during the call as well. To that point, Dan, the discovery to remediation and the 271 days of those vulnerabilities being open, it really keys on the topic that you were talking about of prioritization, right? Really making sure that you attack the things that are most, the riskiest, if you will, to your business, formulating that the risk equals likelihood times impact. And that's something that's going to continue to evolve. So the last thing that I want to touch on before we continue here is, with so many different tools in the marketplace, right? When people are looking at the complexity of how to kind of manage that, what are your thoughts as where we are today for leaders in managing multiple solutions, and what that's going to look like as the market continues to evolve?
Well, this is one of the reasons that I personally got into this business and really came to Darklight. And I've spoken about this in other venues, and sometimes, obviously, I'm a big believer in venture capital and what it does for allowing new technology and solutions to come to market. It's absolutely critical to the overall advantage that we have here in the U.S., especially on taking new technology to market. But with that disclaimer, I've been very open about, I think one of the issues that we have in cybersecurity is this siloed approach to problems. And I do believe the VC community, and I think it's changing, but has generally helped or caused that issue to exist. And what do I mean by that? When you're pitching a venture capital firm for money, they really like a clean story, which makes perfect sense. Identify a problem that's very cut and dry, and identify your solution to solve that problem that's very cut and dry. And so what has occurred is, going back even to the days of, McAfee, early days of McAfee and the true antivirus software, where they're just like, hey, we know there's a virus, we can fingerprint the virus, and we can do a filtering mechanism to stop that virus based on the fingerprint from getting into your system. So problem, solution, black and white. Well, and the reality is, when you think about the complexity of an enterprise, network, IT, devices, software, apps, IoT, all the different things going on in cyber, it's really hard to only focus on one problem. And by focusing on one problem, it's why we have an average of whatever it is, 71 tools in a medium to large business that are used to provide a cybersecurity posture situation. So you've got intrusion detection systems, you've got intrusion prevention systems, you've got antivirus, you've got network traffic monitoring, you've got, phishing tools, you've got your firewall, you've got, just on and on and on. You've got all these different tools that are there to solve one problem.
Yep.
Fusing that information into one place as best you can and reducing the number of tools so that an individual tool can handle more things really has to be where the market goes. And I got off on a bit of a tangent there, Thomas, but I feel very strongly about that. Back to your specific comment.
Valid point. Valid point.
So let's take, for example, your inventory management. So I have one place where I keep my inventory management, and it could be in lots of different places depending on your organization. Well, that inventory management, how is that or where is that correlated to what is the result of your vulnerability scan? So let's just take the most fundamental thing, inventory management, vulnerability scan. If you're not correlating that information, you may have gaps. You have gaps that you don't even know about. And we've always said it's worse to have a false sense of security than knowing you have bad security. Because if you know you have bad, you can attack it. If you think you have good, you're not attacking it. So false sense of security to me is the worst thing that can happen. And if you're not correlating the information from all these different sources, do you really know what's going on in your environment? Now, I'm a believer, unfortunately, to truly know everything in your environment 100% of the time, I think is really, really hard. But there are lots of low-hanging fruit to make dramatic improvements here. And there's an example. What's your ITAM, inventory asset management, versus your vuln scan and other sources of inventory that you can use to get a full picture.
Mm-hmm.
So here becomes the problem. Most of the vulnerability scanners are only going to allow you to look at, sort of what's in your network at that moment in time. And let's say you have now, let's just add another very fundamental cybersecurity tool, an endpoint detection, agent. So pick one, CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, what have you. Well, do you know that the vuln scanner that's looking at these assets compared to your IT asset management system, do you know that Carbon Black, if that's your endpoint detection solution, does it exist on all the endpoints it's supposed to exist on? So again, we've just added a layer of complexity. So it's no wonder that in the cybersecurity market, most, and I mean vast majority, just have this sense of being overwhelmed. So let's try to calm that down, use truly a risk-based approach. Like, what do we care about most? You can't boil the ocean. And let's just start to one by one attack that. What's our inventory as best we can? Are we scanning that inventory appropriately? Do we have other monitoring capabilities like endpoint detection on said inventory? If not, why? That becomes part of your remediation once you understand you're missing perhaps an endpoint detection on a critical piece of asset, but you got to start somewhere.
And Dan, if you really think about it, it's keeping it simple. When you really take that approach, it's aligning what I have and making sure that when I'm pulling data back on my environment holistically, it aligns with the assets that I currently own. Because if there's something that I own that's not pulling back data, that's definitely the biggest risk to your organization. And that does make a lot of sense. Now, if I were to pivot the conversation here, and we're talking about multiple vendors and solutions, a stat that I find kind of interesting is this one right here, where 32% of the time, there's a disagreement over vendor prioritization. With, a lot of these companies using similar threat intelligence to kind of build up their data sets. Why do you think that number is so high?
And I, from my perspective, again, generally speaking, let's start with a baseline and improve from there.
Yeah.
And the question I would be asking if I were buying any of these tools, including our tool, which is, okay, show me your formula. Mm-hmm. I want to understand how you're prioritizing my data. Yeah. And this is where things get tricky. And it's been actually fascinating to me. Again, I think obviously very highly attainable. They have a scoring mechanism. And as they, are acquiring other companies, their prioritization is getting better and better by bringing in more enrichment. But they have a score that when clients look at the list that comes out of that product, and this is true for Qualys or Rapid7 or really all of them, there's a score. Here's your ranking, and there's some score. Some of those scores, this isn't true with Tenable, but a lot of those scores are proprietary, meaning we have our own formula. We weight it this way, weight it that way. I think that can be dangerous for two reasons. One, it's, I think, why you have that stat you just listed.
Mm-hmm.
And two, I think companies sometimes use it more as a marketing effort to create differentiation rather than let's go with the standards-based approach for the industry. Now, the standards-based approach is not a panacea. It's not necessarily a silver bullet. But if we're all speaking on with the same terminology, using the same basic formulas, and then enriching for yourself, so I know that this device is more important than this device, that will impact your risk score, obviously, and some standard won't know that.
Right.
But the basics of, how are you bringing EPSS, which is another scoring engine? How are you bringing Kevin? How are you using CVSS base and temporal scores? How are you using the results of your attack surface baseline to look at an overall risk factor of a device? How are you using, if you're more sophisticated and a little bit bigger with resources, how are you looking at threat intelligence specific to an adversary? So if you're a company, a pharmaceutical company that does testing on animals, that the animal rights groups who are very active, hacktivists, it becomes known what types of exploits and vulnerabilities they use.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you add that context of what that adversary that matters to your organization, that looks at what's the likelihood, how is that being brought into the formula to develop what your risk is? These are hard questions I think customers should ask before they just blindly say, oh, that tool told me this is the number one issue. Why? How? Ask that question is my recommendation, and then we'll certainly, I think, dramatically improve that stat you're showing there.
Dan, I appreciate you answering that. And this kind of makes me want to pivot over into SIO for a moment. And SIO is our tool here at Darklight. And the reason we're going to take a look at it is when we're really thinking about disagreement over vendor prioritization. That's something where it's going to be, vendor agnostic almost, if you will, because the data is being enriched from multiple different data sources, right? So when you're pulling in that TVM report, it's going to be enriched from, not just Kev or EPSS or whatever it is that Tenable's enriching that data set with, if you will. But to our point earlier, it's going to help you to have that prioritization because it's going to enrich that data. Dan, before I pull up SIO with that, logic, if you will, any thoughts you have there?
Well, I can't stress enough on the importance of understanding risk and taking these prioritization in terms of risk to your business. And that's the piece where it does take a little bit of time with your MSSP partner or security consultant, or if you have in-house security staff, for them to work with the business folks on understanding the environment a little bit more clearly on what things would impact the business the most, whether that's worrying about reputation, site going down to where your lifeblood of revenue is impacted, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a piece I strongly push folks to think about. The other thing that's nice about having a well thought out sort of risk understanding is when there is an event or an alert, let's say, that comes from one of your endpoints. So a CrowdStrike throws up an alert and says, hey, this looks weird. Can the SOC or whomever's responding to that alert quickly know, hey, that alert is impacting a device that is extremely important to my organization? Everyone talks about crown jewels analysis. So what devices are most important? Well, the better job you do with that, the more quickly you can take what might be a tier 1 alert jump it to tier 3, and say, hey, this alert is on a critical device. Let's not go through the regular sort of process to make sure it's not a false positive. Let's jump right up to the tier 3 analysis and shut the thing down, or whatever the processes are for your environment. So even in a reaction, I mean, what we're doing here at Darklight with SIO is, in the cyber parlance, left and right of boom, boom being a breach. We're trying to help prevent breaches by good cybersecurity hygiene and posture, but also in the case or at event of breach, let's have that knowledge library of what's going on in your environment, what matters the most, so the SOC and the responders can very quickly understand how impactful it is the business to start the incident response process.
Absolutely, Dan. And that makes a lot of sense. It's really harping on the point that we're talking about today, right? And that's prioritization and that time to remediation. Obviously, as you mentioned before, some of that low-hanging fruit, and I'm talking low-hanging fruit on the other end of the spectrum as far as those low-risk vulnerabilities, those are probably going to stay open for 271 days or more, which is going to skew that average. But in order to have an effective business posture, you're going to need to be able to quickly react and remediate those vulnerabilities that are critical, especially to, you know, those crown jewels, as you mentioned before. That makes complete sense. I appreciate you walking me through that. So as you're looking at here, folks, and Dan, this is the SIO dashboard, right? If you were to log in as a customer, this is exactly what you would see from pulling in your data. Now, the data that we're showing here is a pull of Tenable TVM, right? It's via our API. Now, if we were to show you the same report in parallel, what you would see instantly is the difference of what we're calling risks and vulnerabilities. We're going to also give you some quick top risk severities that you're going to be able to just log in and see. And so if I were to be, you know, somebody in the SOC or anybody handling this process at an MSSP for a customer, I'd automatically know that my biggest risk that I need to at least take a look at is going to be this Log4j remote control, remote code. Now, before I keep going down into the tool, Dan, I'd like for you to kind of talk about where we came in the marketplace. And what I mean by that is really this sources, right? That's going to be something that's going to be the most valuable to this customer base. And as we're looking about prioritization of these risks within their organization. And we've kind of hit on it a little bit through our talk today. But when we're talking about pulling in that data, enriching it, and making it actionable, if you will.
Well, and Thomas, I know that our intent here is not to do some sort of a demo of SIO. This is about really industry knowledge, so we'll walk that line as closely as we can. But I think giving an example could be helpful. So let's go back sort of last first. When we think of responding to an incident. So Thomas, if you would go to assets for me, actually just go to information systems real quick. And just while you're pulling that up, information systems. So everything that we're focused on, when we talk about using standards, we use standards. So the NIST 800-53 is a 600 page, whatever it is now, but a very large document that sort of creates a cybersecurity framework and best practices. And here's an example that's very hard. So if you're supposed to follow the NIST guidelines, talk about overwhelming, it's overwhelming. And an example of here where it's very difficult, logical, but difficult from a framework perspective is, let's say I have an asset that is my e-commerce asset. And my e-commerce asset, they call that an information system. And so that information system is one asset, could be your payroll system, could be your e-commerce site, could be your human resources, whatever. You have an information system. But really that information system, while it's considered one asset in the NIST framework, it actually is a collection of individual assets that could be in the thousands, depending on how large your organization is. So when you think in terms of a response, so you get an incident, and that incident where that alert came on a specific device, which is how they will generally happen, and that individual device might be my laptop, what is the responder supposed to do to really understand the importance of that device? Well, if they can instantly determine, and let's say I'm an e-commerce company, that device is part of the e-commerce information system, which is critical to the organization, you can bypass a lot of wasted effort to try to learn things. You jump that thing right up to tier 3 response, because you've done the work up front to understand risk. And risk cannot be done without impact and likelihood, as we've been talking about. So that impact piece is very, very important. And so what ours, and again, we're not the only one that does this, what you're looking for are tools that allow you to operationalize those frameworks, so you don't have to memorize or try to put into place the 600 pages of NIST 800-53, and just do the work for your most valuable assets first. And by the way, let's say your e-commerce site or e-commerce infrastructure is 1,000 assets, and let's say you're a small business, but you have a lot of assets for your e-commerce site. Well, start with the first 10 and just slowly build your information system so that when there is a response, you can quickly identify this is key issue to the business. Or, as we're talking about mostly today, when you have a new vulnerability, you can prioritize it based on the risk it may cause to your business. And so when we click here on analysis, if you don't mind, Thomas, the other thing that I think is important when you're looking at these tools is, can we visualize what's happening? So we now know that this executive devices information system is made up of these things. Obviously, if there are multiple thousands of these things, this can be pretty complex, but you can quickly dig in and then draw a picture to understand what else could be impacted. And what when you think about the adversary information, so let's say an adversary is attacking a certain exploit or known, and that exploit is using a certain vulnerability. Well, how can you quickly identify where that vulnerability exists within your system? And that's also what you should be looking for out of your tool to say, how can I reverse ways to look at things? So I'll give an example. Click over here to devices for me. So in this case, we're looking at individual devices. And if you click on, just pick one to go into. And so now what we have is information about that device. This information could come from IT asset management. It's going to be populated to some degree, in a large degree, by a vulnerability scanner. But from here, we can specifically see what software is involved on that device. And if we wanted to go from this view to a view on the individual software, you can click on a software. And then from here, you can see if there were risks, or this, everywhere this software exists. So if we had a vulnerability associated with this software, which right now it doesn't look like there is, we could very quickly see where that vulnerability exists throughout our system. And this gets into, how do you respond quicker to dramatically reduce that 271 days when a new, something comes out from CISA? How do I quickly identify how this impacts me? A new exploit is in the wild. How do I know how this impacts me? And that's a big part where you should be looking for from your vuln scanner, from whatever tool you're using. How can I quickly get to that, the information I need to make a change quickly?
Dan, I appreciate you kind of walking us through that. And it's really true, right? I think it's something that's going to be continuously evolving, as we've mentioned before, especially with the adoption of continuous new tools across the environment and just the ever changing landscape, if you will. Vulnerabilities are going to continue to be exploited, and it's something that we're going to have to react to. And that 271 days, as long as the things that are low and not impactful, right, as you talk about the risk likelihood to your business impact, go after those last, but making sure that you're able to flag and take action on the things that are most impactful to your team and your organization quickly. That's obviously the main reason that we're all here in the cybersecurity world. Quickly, last thing that I want to do just for the team before we hop out of SIO, if this was something that you were going to need to pass on to somebody else within your team, you quickly have the ability to cut a PDF or to just cut an image of this report. You can also build out a canned report for your executive team. If you have any questions, if this is something that you'd like to look at outside of that, please let us know. And we're going to continue on with our conversation. And if anyone in the audience has any questions about prioritization, applying threat intel, or anything from the likes, we'd be more than happy to take those questions from the audience. If not, That's more than fine for the time, and you guys can send them to us after the fact. Dan, I think the thing that we really should talk about while we're waiting for those questions is, when there's 40 from, this was another stat that I thought was interesting, that 45% of staffing constraints and manual processes, are felt by the industry. Do you think that that's because there's, too many silos, there's too many checks and balances, there's bad data coming in? 45%, is really high as I look at that. What are your thoughts there?
Boy, this one's hotly debated. In fact, I also saw something in the last week or so about, what really is the staffing deficiency in cybersecurity, and you will have stats that suggest, we are millions short in the workforce, and other folks will say, boy, that's exaggerated because of X, Y, Z. For this specific stat, my opinion is pretty simple. There's too much to do. There is just flat out too much to do. And there's too much having to switch from one dashboard in a tool to another dashboard to another dashboard. And obviously, we've created a dashboard. There's reasons for it. Our vision is to be the place that fuses this information. And because we're using a knowledge-based AI that's explainable, reproducible, et cetera, and was built to fuse the different enrichment sources and analyze those and create predictable results. We think we have a differentiator, but we are adding to the problem because we are bringing a new dashboard to the equation. And so when you sit in these SOCs, and I've sat in SOCs of Fortune 100 businesses, and the staff you can even really afford to have, even the largest of companies sitting in a SOC, and they're having to watch and deal with 70 plus tools, there's no other word but overwhelming. There's no other way to put it but overwhelming. And so, using some combination of your MSP, your MSSP, plus good tooling, understanding what your tech stack is, prioritizing based on a risk equation, which is impact times likelihood, what matters to your business, what adversaries might care about your business. These are all things that experts, consultants, MSSPs, or if you internal, you just start to slowly chip away to make sure, back to the focus of this event, prioritizing resources. Because if that is true, clearly you want your resources focused on your biggest risk first. And that does take a process to understand what those are.
It's true. And that really does take it, as you were talking about, is getting the clarity of those puzzle pieces. Understanding if you don't know the answer, relying on outside sources as MSSPs or consultants to help you to build that picture out, and utilizing that time of is essence mindset, if you will.
One more Thomas, while I'm thinking of it, I want to make sure I give credit. Mm-hmm. The gentleman's name I quoted this morning is Patrick Garrity, Garrity. He was with a very friendly competitor of ours called Nucleus, but now he's with something called Vulncheck. Might be a competitor. I haven't heard of them before, but he posted something about what the UK National Cybersecurity Center out of the UK published, which I thought was very insightful just a little bit earlier today. And this is what's also super cool to me about the cyber community. Mm-hmm. And most of us in the industry, and I certainly would like to consider myself in this part or this camp. There's competition, but it is such a big problem. The competitors should work nicely together. So, for example, Tenable and Qualys and Rapid7 are fierce competitors. However, they have open AIs that any of the tools could ingest information from the other. Mm-hmm. And the harder you make that for people to ingest the information coming out of your tool, to me, the more painful it is and less helpful it is to the industry. And so, working together and realizing there's lots of ways to skin the cat, whatever, is really important here. And we like to be friendly to the competition because there's a lot of good options out there.
And Dan, you hit the nail on the head, just industry in general. And that's something that I've always found as an interesting topic is before it used to be that cybersecurity teams weren't communicating much. Now, this was a long time ago, but adversaries obviously were sharing information, right? This is an active exploit, what have you. Well, the fact that the cybersecurity community took that same approach of sharing and making sure that it was holistic and that people were, even if it's a competitor, if you will, if you're talking, Visa and American Express, I guarantee you in the common world, the financial services team has much more communication, which is great because to your point, making that information easily ingestible, whether it's something that's a competitor or you're ingesting somebody's data, as you mentioned, in a competitive field, it's good to be able to make that actionable quickly for the consumer. The last thing that we're going to touch on today, folks, is that nearly 1/3 of detected vulnerabilities are remaining open for after a year, Dan. Now, my thought process is this is fruit that is just so low hanging that it doesn't matter to the team to remediate, one, or it is so business critical that they can't make that adjustment and they're okay with accepting the risk. Now, that's my thought process. What do you think that is?
Well, in the second part, you said what I believe you meant, and I certainly agree with, is in some cases a vulnerability may exist on a device that is using legacy software that can't be fixed or changed without potentially hurting the business process itself. So, in other words, even though there's a known vulnerability, by fixing it, you're going to cause another issue to happen that could impact the business. And so there's lots of those accepted risks out there. And something also that I'd be looking for is, when a business has to choose to accept a risk, let's accept it so that you don't have to re-accept it every single time you run a scan. But if attributes of that risk change, so let's say you decide to accept a risk of a vulnerability that has a score of X with a EPSS of Y and blah, blah, blah. If those scores change, you have a new risk, you have a new equation. So is there a way to look at that? So, but yes, I actually agree with what you've said there, Thomas, on both counts.
Awesome, Dan. Well, again, thank you so much for taking some time out to talk with us a little bit today. Audience, if you do have any questions, feel free and throw them in the chat now while we're here, or shoot us an email. As you see before, here is all of our different things on social media. Feel free and follow us.
Thomas, I got a question from a friend watching through my personal text.
Yeah.
And let me just, it's what it's asking about is the idea of threat intelligence and what does that mean as an enrichment source. And I think he's leading me with the question. And this is sort of a nuance, but I think it's important depending on where the audience sits in their cybersecurity journey. We talk about threat intelligence and enrichment sources almost the same. And I think technically you could suggest that that's true. So, for example, information about an individual vulnerability could be considered threat intelligence. And we do consider it threat intelligence because it is information about a threat. If I have a vulnerability in my system, what is, that's a threat. So what's anything about that individual threat is threat intelligence. A lot of people do believe, and I think it's more commonplace to think of threat intelligence as threat about the adversary. So about the bad guy. So what do we know about APT3, which is a Chinese adversary, and they have whatever 7 campaigns that they've known have been run, and we know that there's playbooks, adversary playbooks, on exactly the process they follow to attack somebody. That is threat intelligence about the adversary. And so we do sort of mix and match those words. Clearly, by the question he sent me, I was mix and matching those words, but that's how we delineate the two. It's all threat intelligence. And even when you think of enrichment sources, not all of them may be considered threat intelligence. So like enrichment source may be, hey, how important is this device to my computer, to my organization? So that's an impact component. That's an enrichment source, isn't threat intelligence. No. So they really aren't interchangeable. And if I was interchanging them today, my apologies, and thanks to my friend for the text.
Dan, no, that's a really great point, and I appreciate you getting that text as well. And it really does make sense, right? The threat feed versus an enrichment source and what that data ingest actually means at a basic level, and then continuing to build out your picture as you were talking about the puzzle earlier. Great call out from the audience. We appreciate the interaction. Any other questions, any thoughts that you have today, Dan, before I kind of wrap us up and get us into thanking everyone for their time today?
No, I just would love to reset that this is legitimately an overwhelming thing to protect an environment from cybersecurity threats. It's overwhelming. And the best way to deal with overwhelming is just to get started and try to do your best to understand what will I get the biggest bang for the buck if I do X first, hence prioritization. Just get started. Tremendous resources out there. Whether or not you want to learn more about SIO or Darklight, if great if you do. But if you have questions about how you're attacking or how you're trying to prioritize, please reach out to Thomas. We'll help out as much as we can. There's lots of great resources on LinkedIn and other places where you can sort of go through this with yourself. If you're a small business watching, there's something called the Cyber Readiness Institute. CRI, they offer some great free resources. In fact, there's even some free scanning tools out there for some of the smaller businesses. So if we can be helpful there, we are sort of a startup, so we don't want to overpromise, but please reach out. We're here to help.
Dan, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us and really talking about the industry in whole, right? It's always nice to be able to talk about how we can help a solution. But really, when people are looking at it holistically, sometimes the problem that they're facing might not be the solution that's in the market, but being able to get a good standpoint of how to have better cybersecurity practices, as long as we're sharing that data and continuing to refine the industry, that's what needs to happen. So again, thanks for coming on. Everybody, as Dan was saying, right? If you would like to get more information about SIO or how Darklight can help be a part of that conversation, whether you're an independent organization, an MSSP, or an MSP, here's our contact information. Feel free and let us know. Feel free to follow us on Darklight. And again, we'll be having our next webinar on March 13th. Invites will be coming out soon. Thanks again, everyone. And Dan, thank you so much again for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.